Mathematics anxiety. What a beast that is. It is 100% a thing, and many of us have experienced that. Many of us as adults, many of us as children, and I'm sure there are many of us that are watching our children go through that right now. In today's video, I am joined by two team members of the Maths Pathway program. And they're going to share with us some tools that we can use to foster a positive mindset around mathematics. So let's just dive straight in. We have Bex and Matthew joining us from Maths Pathway today. So we've got some new Maths Pathway faces, which I'm really excited about, to tackle, I think, probably one of the biggest topics around mathematics. I'm pretty sure both of you would agree with me, Maddie and Bex, but I'm going to hand the floor straight over to them so that we can get straight into today's workshop.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I'm Maddie, and I'm joined with Bex as well. Both of us have been maths teachers for a really long time. We're talking 20, 30 years, so a really long time. And we're excited to be here, and hopefully this will be a helpful workshop for you guys. Both of us have had extensive training in growth mindset and have applied it to schools and with our students. And so we've seen these techniques that we're going to talk you through actually have a really positive impact on students. So hopefully this will be quite useful. So just an overview of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to be talking about why maths is different, growth mindset, what it actually is and why it matters, how to manage maths anxiety. So as teachers, we often talk to parents, and we know that often the maths anxiety is not only limited to the students themselves, it often comes through from via the parents as well. So it's really important to manage both of those. How to actually use maths at home in the everyday kind of environment to help with the motivation and to help with all these issues as well. And then finally, we're going to delve into a little bit of more technical stuff with the neuroscience of how students learn maths in particular, but also how they learn in general. And we're looking at a particular neuroscientist and contemporary research there. Now, there's a reason why maths is seen as being different for people. There's a lot of, it seems there's a lot more anxiety around mathematics. There's a real understanding in society that mathematics is important, or that's the way that people feel about it, because there is an understanding that, it's a gatekeeper or gatekeeper course for a lot of careers for students and a lot of, future success. So a lot of the, engineering, medicine, nursing, computer science all require a higher level of mathematics. And so that anxiety kind of filters through to the students. And there's a fear of failure. So getting the question right or wrong is something that is really prevalent in mathematics as opposed to other subjects where that can be a little bit less black and white. A really common issue is that, in traditional schooling, so this is where you guys have a real advantage. In traditional schooling, it's often the education is age-based. And so a student will come into, say, year 7, and they will be expected to keep up with the year 7 work. However, they may have gaps. They often have gaps from primary school, and that causes a lot of issue. It really affects students' working memory and their ability for them to pick up new concepts. And often, and this is a problem that, I saw all the time with students that had, for instance, a tutor or something like that, was really unhelpful for them to have a procedural understanding. It's a very easy thing to do because you're like, oh, I just want you to get through it. I just want you to be able to get the right answer here. However, in the long term, that is not ideal, because what you find is that students that have learnt in a procedural way, as soon as something has slightly shifted, slightly changed, they are no longer able to apply their knowledge, which is exactly what you don't want. So it's worth investing the time for them to learn things in a deeper conceptual way. So now we're going to talk about growth mindset. What is it? First of all, it's the belief that your brain can grow and that you can learn, and that, learning requires dedication. It requires hard work. And for students to see making mistakes as an opportunity for growth rather as a metric of failure or something like that. And this is opposed to what we call a fixed mindset. And that's the belief that you're either a maths person or you're not. So, that you have a fixed ability, particularly in subjects like mathematics, that is really quite prevalent, that belief that, some people are either born with it or they're not. And, you see this with students when they say things like, oh, I'm just not a maths person. You also see it with parents. They often try and excuse things and they're like, I'm not a maths person. And they also think like, if I have to try hard, that also means that I'm not a maths person. But that goes against what we know about how the brain actually learns. They also feel that if they get something wrong, it's also an indicator that they're bad at maths. We'll see why these are not the ideal ways of thinking about, learning. And what we see when students have this fixed mindset is they avoid. So they have an avoidance. They actually don't even want to try, particularly harder problems, and they will give up much, much faster. So really what you want is you want students to have grit. You want them to persevere and keep on working on something despite it being difficult. And this fear of mistakes, it obviously really limits learning. And so we want to find ways to counter that. Now, a growth mindset, so to identify a student that has a growth mindset, the sort of things that they will say are mistakes help me learn. They'll say, I can improve my maths ability. I just need to work at it. I need to put in some effort. I need to practice, and I have that capacity to do better. And if I'm struggling, so this one is huge. If I'm struggling, what that means is I am actually learning. My brain is growing. So this is fantastic. And it's not that difficult. Like we've seen it, Bex and I have seen it in practice in a classroom when you start to apply these principles and you teach students about growth mindset. We have seen that shift. And it's not that hard to actually do in practice, which is what's really exciting here. And so what you find when students embrace a growth mindset, they will embrace challenges, they will persist. And a key element of growth mindset is to actually use the feedback. So some people, this is a misconception with growth mindset. Some people believe it stops at, it's okay, you don't quite get it yet, and you've made a mistake and it's good to make mistakes. That's part of it, but the next step, the really key step in growth mindset is that you have a strategy, you have a next step. It's like, how do you use the feedback in order to improve your understanding? If that element is missing, then we're not quite there yet with the growth mindset and what the psychology actually says. Okay, so here's the key question. What if your child actually has a fixed mindset? What can you do about it? Well, as I mentioned, you can teach them how to have a growth mindset. And this, when I found this out, this was amazing. This was like a huge like light bulb moment for me that the research, so this is research that they've done with students, just telling students that learning something new will grow the brain, that will actually grow physical neural connections in the brain, that in itself increases their test scores. It just goes to show how powerful this mindset is. And, I saw it in practice as a school teacher, when we'd do something that was more challenging in class, I'd have the kids, saying to me at the end of the class, oh, Miss, my brain hurts after this. And my response would always be, awesome. That means your brain is growing. And you would immediately see them smile and be like, oh, that's actually a good thing. My brain is getting better because I've engaged and I've challenged myself. So yeah, that was always a really positive feedback that we got from students when, you taught them about this and said to them, you're growing your brain by putting the effort in. Now, as parents, what can we do to help foster a growth mindset? And a lot of this is about the language that you use and the way that you approach it. And, as a school teacher, I'm going to be honest, you want to remember to say these things. And so what I often did was I used to put posters up on my wall just as reminders. And we will share with you guys a PDF that has some of these catchphrases so that you guys can use it as a reference and refer back to it. Because you can very easily forget to say these things, but in practice, it's part of your lexicon, it's a part of how you speak to students about their maths learning, it really does make a difference. So please don't say, I was never good at maths. Yeah, maybe say, I never worked at it, or, I never had the opportunity to work at it and grow and become better at it. The other really damaging thing that I've seen, and it's not just parents that are guilty of this, teachers are also, is saying to students, you are so smart. And the reason why this is damaging is because it reinforces intelligence as fixed. What we see here is those students that have been told their entire life that they're smart, they feel that they don't need to put effort in. And they get to a certain level where all of a sudden it's difficult and they don't have the strategies that they need in order to persevere, in order to get over that hump. And you see these smart students all of a sudden dropping out of math methods and specialist maths, going to university, getting into a really good course, but then dropping out because they don't have these strategies. So we're looking for long-term success here, right? It's a long game here about what we say to kids about, the learning process. And this is a huge one too. So, and this is really prevalent in schools, that focus on that final test score or the result has also been found. So there's a lot of research on this has been found to be quite damaging. And the issue with it is that it focuses on the correct answers rather than the learning process itself. Which is what you want to do. So the learning is what we're interested in. The research has shown that, if you gave students one test that had no mark, but a lot of feedback, as opposed to a test that had the same types of feedback, but a test score, the way that the students responded to each was vastly different. And the students ended up improving much more when they had the test that had no marks. And so we'll talk about, the kind of techniques that you can use that really follow this psychology. Yeah, this is just talking more about this. So, really that focus on the test score, it also, feeds into their anxiety. You'll see here, we'll come back to the same theme. So whether we're talking about growth mindset or anxiety or the neuroscience, they all kind of lead and to the same kind of ideas. It's really nice the way they all support each other. And that focus on the test score also undermines, intrinsic motivation. What you really want is you want the students to have deep engagement, to really want to learn and to have curiosity about mathematics, as opposed to responding to extrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation would be something like, I'm going to give you $100 if you get over 90% on your test, right? So we see that sometimes, and it's really easy to be like, oh, okay, this is let's focus on that test score. This is what we really want. But again, playing the long game, it's not what you want. You want a student to have intrinsic motivation. You want them to want to learn. And what I've found as a teacher is that the way they feel about their maths, when they feel that they're starting to have success and that it's something that they can engage with and that they can learn, that is the biggest motivator that I have found. So a student that feels like they're learning, they just keep on going, right? It really unlocks their potential. So these are really important kind of messages to have. Some things that you can say, again, these are posters I had up on, my wall as a teacher. Carol Dweck, so he's the psychologist from Stanford University who talks a lot and has written the book on growth mindset, says use the power of yet. So say, I don't know it yet, right? It talks again about the capacity to learn and praise the process. Say to your kids, I'm really proud of the effort that you've put in. Like we know that that's what it takes to actually be successful in maths. Next key part here is that I talked about before is the strategies. Now, what do I mean by strategies? Sometimes it's as simple as, can we think of a different way to approach this problem? But sometimes it also means that there's a knowledge gap. There might be, for example, if a student is adding fractions, they might not understand exactly what a fraction means, or they might understand why, you don't have to add the numerators. So it could be a knowledge gap that's missing as well. So that's why when we say strategies, that's super important step. And then praise the effort rather than, the end results. You've worked really hard on this. This is just a bit of an overview of all the things that we've just talked about. And I think the last one here is, really resonates with me as well. For both yourselves and for students, never label somebody as good or bad at maths. Those labels are unnecessary and sometimes harmful. It's better to think of it as like we're all capable of achieving, in mathematics, which is true. The research really backs that up. And so, but we need to put in some effort and work on it. I'm going to hand over now to Bex, who's going to talk about maths anxiety.
Thanks, Maddie. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit of a focus on maths anxiety, what it is, what might be the things or the triggers behind it, and then just some things that you can try at home that can help to reduce that anxiety. Some things that I think are very probably work best at home, and some things that I've tried as a teacher that have also translated to at home. I have two children myself, and manage one who is very, very good at maths, gets it really quickly, and one who struggles a bit more. And so, I've been there and seen her have some maths anxiety as well. So what is maths anxiety? It's really just that worry, that tension, those feelings that we get, those physiological symptoms of increased heart rate or breathing rate, or even cognitive symptoms about negative thoughts and worries that are sort of making it difficult for us to learn, that are associated specifically with a maths task. And what that can do is that can block our working memory. So our working memory is a really crucial part of our memory system, that is our temporary storage, and it is very, very important for learning mathematics. It's the information that we are holding to then retrieve other information from other parts of our memory system. And when that is blocked, we're going to lead to things like difficulty concentrating, we're going to make errors, easily distracted. We might feel threatened. So we have those like nervous system responses where we kind of freeze and we have that blanking. I know that I've seen that with students in my classroom when I've asked them a question, and then there's sort of like the look goes over their face and they're like, oh no, she's asked me and I wish they hadn't asked me. And they get sort of very worried about it, and you can see that. And so often I would then sort of encourage them or move on and ask another student and give them time to sort of calm down. But what maths anxiety can do over time, and we might all experience it. I know I have when I've been out for dinner with friends, and because I'm a maths teacher and a maths person, they'll be like, oh, you can sort out how much we need to pay on the bill because you're really good at maths, because you can do that division in your head. And so even I'm a bit like, oh my goodness, now the pressure's on. You can have that as sort of like a small little moments that we might experience, or it might be bigger experiences that happen often and often. And then it can lead to things like avoidance. So I've seen that in my classroom, students who, they don't want to do the work that they're being asked to do. They find ways to procrastinate and not do the thing that they've been asked to do. And a lot of it leads down, they've got low confidence and they don't feel great about themselves or about what they're learning in maths. So some of the things that can lead to maths anxiety, it might just be sometimes it could be passed down unintentionally. So I know that some of those messages that Maddie was talking about earlier around sort of like parents or other family members, well, I was never really good at maths, and that so children can feel that they're not very good at maths, and so it can lead to that. It could be the result of many negative experiences for them in mathematics. As has already been mentioned, that idea of having gaps in your prior knowledge, so you can't make those connections with that new learning. But it can also be a bit of an indicator that that particular person has a bit of a fixed mindset about their particular learning in mathematics. So what are some of the things that you can do to help sort of reduce anxiety at home if you see it? So something that I find very successful, particularly with my own kids, is this idea of validation. So sort of, sitting with them and being like, I can see you're really struggling with this, or that sounds really, really tricky. And what I've found personally is that with that is that then sort of opens up the doors for me to problem solve with them. and encourage them to look at things from a different perspective and be like, can we draw a picture maybe to see if that helps your understanding? Can we maybe use a manipulative? So for an example, counters, can we maybe show our thinking with counters? And sometimes that can be enough to just sort of trigger some other learning or that they may have and help support, or they might see things a little bit differently or see the connections and suddenly have their little light bulb moment. So for example, on those images, sorry, Maddie, can we go back?
Sorry.
No, this is tricky, isn't it? So for example, like learning fractions on a number line, students find that notoriously very, very difficult to do. And I know that with my children about that age where they're learning that as well. But they really understand the idea of fractions in a diagram like a bar model, or or circles and things where it's been split up into those parts. And using something like a bar model alongside the number line can actually help to reinforce and help them to see the connection between knowledge that they already, or something they already understand in mathematics, and then how that relates to this new area that they're learning. So for example, finding them on the number line. And there's a lot of research out there as well that trying to connect those different representations of mathematics visually for children can be a really helpful way of them learning and understanding the new concept. So other ways of sort of reducing anxiety at home is keeping things low pressure, playful, looking for lots of joyful opportunities with mathematics. I'll give some examples in a moment. Offering some reassurance and calm. So particularly if you are someone who is quite anxious about mathematics yourself, trying to sort of, keep that under wraps. I know I do this in other areas of my life, not necessarily mathematics, but other areas where I get anxious about things and I have to hold it in to not make my children anxious about it too. And being calm about it, using sort of short, regular practice, and the maths pathway model is really, really great for that. And then using real life maths problems as well. So that relatability. So, and sort of feeling like, okay, there's a purpose or a sense to why I'm doing mathematics as well. So I thought I'd give a couple of suggestions here of some ways in which we can reframe learning that I think can be quite helpful in reducing anxiety, and also link in nicely with the ideas that Mattie's already talked about in terms of growth mindset. And one of them is really sort of normalizing the process of learning. And the Learning Pit by James Nottingham, and you can have a look in more detail around this, is a really nice way of thinking about what happens when we learn a new concept. And that idea that we sort of innately think that we have an idea of what might be going on, but then we have a series of errors or a series of things that, like, mistakes that we might make, and we're like, okay, that's not quite right. And you sort of fall into a little bit of a pit of confusion. I'm not really sure how this works yet. I need to work out how to do it. I don't really know how to work out where it is. And it's okay. And it's all right, and it's okay to sit in that pit for a little while. I certainly had experiences of this learning maths myself, particularly when I got to university. And I had a tutor who gave me some great advice and said, you're going to have moments where you're like, I don't know what's going on and I don't know how to do this, and it's going to cause frustration. Stick it in a drawer, put it in a drawer, leave it alone, let your subconscious, work on it for a little while. And then 2 days later, you're in the shower and suddenly you have a light bulb moment. You go, oh, what if I did this? How would that work? And then all of a sudden you start to see the patterns coming together. And that happened a number of times for me, and it was really, really, really helpful. And that's when I kind of saw my biggest learning pits with mathematics. But it's that idea of, like, we're in the pit and it's okay. We can work hard to get out the pit and then have our eureka moment on the other side. And a nice activity to do is to, get kids to draw their own pit, get them to sort of figure out, like, how do they feel at different points in that pit, and really normalize that it's okay to feel this way. It's okay to feel confused, and it's okay to struggle. And that sort of leads nicely into my other suggestion, which is to have a look at Jo Bowler's work, and particularly her website, uCubed, which is, and Jo Bowler's a maths education expert. She's works out of Stanford University. She's worked quite closely alongside Carol Dweck, so in that growth mindset space. And she's all about embracing struggle. So embrace the struggle in mathematics. It's okay to struggle. It means our brains are growing. And she's got some fantastic videos that are really targeted at young people. So it's at their level, at their language, which is really helpful. And that's all free on her website. And she encourages this idea of focusing on joyful maths experiences and really changing our beliefs around mathematics. And the research is showing us that what we believe about maths will shape the way that our brain functions and what we learn in maths. And I actually had a look this morning and found this great page on her website, which is U Cubed at Home, which I think sort of came out of the COVID pandemic era, where they've actually taken a lot of their ideas and modified them to be really home friendly. And there was a heap on there, and they all sort of indicate what sort of year levels that they'd be appropriate for, and there's videos and things as well. So definitely a good resource to go and have a look at. And the final sort of couple of suggestions that I'm going to give are just around sort of some everyday sort of math stuff. This is things that I do at home with my own kids, and highly encouraged. So board games, card games, they're all great. They're filled with mathematical concepts, things like probability, addition and subtraction, logic, geometry, looking for patterns. And they're all really great skills that help students to learn in mathematics, even if they're not, calculating probability, they're having experiences with randomness. And so when they actually come around to learn probability, they have more sort of a sense of like, what does it mean when I roll the dice? And the chance of me getting a 1, they have sort of more of a concept of that. And so, even something as simple as snakes and ladders and, Connect 4 are great. There's a couple of other examples here I've got on the screen that are a bit more mathematical based. My kids particularly love sets, and that's very much looking at patterns and combinations that go together. And for very young children, tiny polka dots is brilliant. It gets them to really think about looking at number in different forms, and using their ability to subitize and be able to look at sort of a number of dots on a card and know how many dots there is. And there's lots of different games that you can play with those as well. My kids loved those when they were really little. And Genius Star is a favorite of ours. That's fitting shapes into a particular space. So it's a lot of spatial awareness and geometry, which is great. And other sort of everyday activities that you can look at are things like, cooking and measuring. Certainly when I'm doing cooking and things with my kids, if we're doing baking, we talk a lot about fractions in terms of, how many teaspoons we might need of something. If my recipe requires 3/4 of a teaspoon, how can I get that? Oh, well, I can use 3 1/4 teaspoons, or, oh, actually I could use the half plus a quarter. And so you're starting to build some sort of understanding around different sort of fractions. There's ratios in there. If I want to double the recipe or half the recipe, what does that mean to the number of cups or teaspoons I need of something? And obviously units of measurement. Budgeting and shopping, so finances, percentages in a real world context. My favorite is actually with the kids when we're going in the supermarket, and obviously a lot of the labels now will give you your sort of, not necessarily your unit cost, but your cost per 100 grams or 100 mils. And often things are on offer and the kids will be like, oh, mum, you should buy that particular one because you can get 2 for however much. But if we then look at how much it is per 100 grams, there might actually be another option available that's not on offer, but is actually cheaper per 100 grams. So that's actually my better buy. And so you can have that conversation around what's a good buy. And so supermarket labels are great for that. Estimating, comparing, sorting, we can do all those kinds of activities easily at home. And then things like getting kids out doing some construction and building and gardening and having to use spatial awareness and units of measurement are also great ideas as well for at home. I'll hand back to Maddie to talk about some neuroscience.
Thank you, Bex. And as you were talking, one of the things that really stood out to me was that all these things that Bex has suggested to really reduce anxiety are backed up by the neuroscience. Are super, super interesting. I'm gonna, hopefully this interests people. I found it very interesting when I started learning about this. And again, this also feeds back to growth mindset ideas as well. So yeah, it's really, really fantastic. So again, the neuroplasticity, the fact that, with growth and effort, that's what it requires for our brains to grow, and that mistakes are super important for that learning process, and that it's not in necessarily you're not a maths person. It's not a real thing to say that you're a maths person. Everybody can learn maths. It's accessible to every single person. So I'm going to talk specifically about a particular neuroscientist called Stanislas Dehaene. He's written quite a few books that you guys might be interested in. The first one is How We Learn. It's the new science of education and the brain. He has one that I'll touch on in a little bit called The Number Sense, which is how the brain learns mathematics specifically. And I've noticed he's also written, his most recent book is on how people learn to read. So these are super interesting books, and there are lessons here for all of us about how we learn and how we teach other people to learn and to really use the neuroscience to help maximize that learning. And one of the things that he says is that, we're all born primed to learn maths and, other things. However, it's not just going to happen automatically. We need proper stimulation to learn. And even though plasticity is is greatest in the early years, it continues throughout your life. So your brain has that capacity to learn throughout your life. There are 4 pillars of learning that he talks about, and they all have educational implications. The first one is attention. The implication here is that you need to create environments where a student can pay attention or where your child can pay attention. That means no distractions. There needs to be, this is really, really important. So, I wouldn't encourage trying to learn maths while other things are going on in the household at the same time. The second one is active engagement. If a child is not actively engaged in the learning, it's not going to happen. So it's important to create processes where there's the ability to predict and say, so again, this is like looking at that curve, that pit, that learning pit that Bex was talking about before. So to predict and say, oh, I don't know, maybe I'll get this, and then to test a thing, and then to adjust based on, what the answer is or what the answer should be. And so here, in terms of the educational implication, it's to encourage participation, to say you must be actively engaged, and the trial and error part, the making mistakes, is important here. Again, harping back to, the growth mindset ideas too. The error feedback, we'll talk a little bit more about feedback in a second and what the most effective type of feedback is. But it's important that you create an environment where students see errors as safe, and not only safe, but a prerequisite for learning. And they should be seen as, oh, I've made a mistake. Here's my opportunity to learn and to grow my brain. And finally, consolidation. So again, your learning should provide opportunities for this. So this is the repetition, the review, and the test. And we'll talk more about that in a little while, but also the importance of sleep. So we'll look at that in more detail about what the neuroscience says about sleep and why it's important. And this is the process of, transferring what you've just learned from your short-term memory into your long-term memory. So talking about tests, as we'd said before, it's not about the final result. It's about strengthening the learning. And as a teacher, my students did sort of hate this when I did this to them. I'd give them a surprise test, but I never graded it. They would get feedback. They would know what mistakes they made. But for me, it was a learning opportunity for them. And I found during this, they made great strides in their learning. When they had the opportunity to check, right? Have you actually learnt the things that we've talked about in class? And if they hadn't, they got feedback that allowed them to correct those mistakes. They had massive growth during those. So use tests in that way, not as an evaluative mechanism, but as a learning tool. And there's the work of Dylan William has been extremely useful for me as a teacher. He talks about different types of assessment. And particularly here, we're talking about formative assessment. What that is assessment for learning, the assessment that actually helps students learn. It needs to have 3 characteristics, or the most effective type of formative assessment has these 3 characteristics. The first one is that it is short cycle. That means that the students are getting the feedback immediately. It is specific, so it's actually honing in on a particular element, and then it's actionable. there's a next step. Again, that feeds back into the growth mindset. The important thing is what is the strategy? What can I actually do to now move my learning forward? And a really good book here is an Embedded Formative Assessment from Dylan William. He's written a lot of books, and there's a lot of stuff out there that if you are interested in learning more about that. The next thing that I'm going to touch on is sleep and the importance of sleep. So this is based on the work of Matthew Walker. He has a book called Why We Sleep, and he says that sleep is absolutely necessary for learning. It both before the learning and after the learning. Before the learning, it clears your short-term memory and it primes the brain to learn. And after the learning, it consolidates it. So it moves the learning from your short-term memory, which is in your hippocampus, to your long-term memory, which is in your neocortex. But it also helps to connect the new learning with existing ideas in your brain, and it helps, your brain find patterns and create, leaps in your learning as well. So sleep is super important. And he gives some, some stats about what happens if you don't sleep. So it can impair your ability to learn by up to 40%, and you have poor attention, poor focus, a weaker working memory, a reduced learning capacity, and higher emotional reactivity and anxiety. So all the things that we talked about that were essential for learning are hindered by not getting enough sleep. And so, as a parent, the recommendation here is for adolescents to have about 8 to 10 hours of sleep. And also, one of the things that he advocates for, which as homeschooling parents is a thing that you can probably put into place, is he advocates for later school start times, because really early times actually disrupt the natural circadian rhythms for children. And so he suggests that that should happen across the board because of how important sleep is. And this is just generally, what we've learned is that, really, if you want to maximize learning, you should work with how the brain works. You should take these lessons with you to help you. And one of the key things here that really sticks out to me is that passive learning is largely ineffective. So, things like watching lectures and just listening to things, like, that's not the best way to learn, and that's particularly true for mathematics. The best way to learn is to do it, to be actively engaged, to try it, to make mistakes. And it's a thing that, I made mistakes with when I was learning in high school, but also in at university, where you would listen to a lecture and you're like, oh yeah, I got it. That's not enough. Actually, that's not the best way to learn. You have to do it yourself. You need to try it out yourself. And again, this is just a summary of all these things. What are the components that neuroscience tells us are super important for learning? Being an active learner, the feedback, the spaced repetition. So that's like the testing and practicing over time, and the sleep hygiene are super, super important elements. And very briefly, I'm going to talk about his next book, which is The Number Sense, which talks specifically about how the brain learns mathematics. And the important thing here, there's a few things. The first one is that it's like innate. Part of this is innate, particularly the brain being able to approximate things and estimate things is something that students have, or kids have, from really, really early on. And what we need to do is move them on from that approximate thinking to more exact reasoning, which is what mathematics does at the higher levels. And also a thing that's not innate is the symbolic maths. That's something that requires explicit teaching. I've tried to summarize this as much as possible. Again, one of the things that also stood out for me here is that students' ratios should be more intuitive, or are more intuitive. That's what the neuroscience shows, than things like differences. But sometimes we shy away from teaching fractions because we think that they're difficult for students. But in fact, that ability to compare things is more innate. So we should not shy away from teaching fractions really early and proportional thinking. And to use visuals like Bex showed with her number line and the bars is a really effective way of doing that. So yeah, don't shy away from that proportional reasoning. It's something that students have a natural ability towards. And just generally, some key takeaways is that, think about these things when you're teaching your children, the ideas behind growth mindset, how to reduce the anxiety, how to use everyday maths to engage and get that motivation going, and use the lessons from neuroscience. What we have done is we've put together a PDF that has a bunch of these references if you're interested in further reading as well. We have links to Carol Dweck's books, to Joe Bowler's books on mathematical mindsets, and to Stanislas Dehaene, his books as well as Matthew Walker's books. So if you guys want any further reading, there's plenty out there to help you. And we're now going to open up to a Q&A. I might stop sharing so that we can have a more of a conversation.
Perfect. Thank you. That was really interesting. I'm just so into the brain and where neuroscience is taking us and just how much we're learning, not only in education and learning, but overall as human beings. So I really appreciated that. It was really well done. Thank you very much. Um, I have actually a couple of questions back on the growth mindset, where you mentioned struggle, and that struggle being a good thing for us. How much struggle? As
That's
a
an
parent, especially as a parent, we often don't have that background, I guess, that teachers do in the classroom. How much do we allow our child to struggle before it's too much?
That is an excellent question, because it's like Beck said, if it gets to the point where it's the anxiety is too high and you start getting students, shutting down, that's not what you want. That's the key element that I talked about, the strategy is where you guys come in. I think you let them struggle for a little bit. You might choose at some point to say, let's put this problem away. But I don't think it's like an endless struggle. I think, the strategy needs to come in pretty fast and be like, okay, what can we do? You can't just let, the child flounder forever. You know, you need to provide them with next steps, something to try, or what, having a conversation like, okay, let's understand which bits you understand and which bits you don't understand. So, can you explain your thinking so far? And then maybe you can identify areas where they've kind of gone wrong, and then you can kind of redirect their thinking. Or if you're not quite sure yet, say like, what can we do? Can we draw a picture of this? I find that myself very helpful. And it is like a strategy that I've used a lot with students. But I think also, and I think this is important as well, is that as parents and as teachers, definitely, I would always be prepared. What that meant was I would always try a problem on my own, and I would think about what possible directions can this go into, and therefore if a student struggled at this point, what sort of questions could I ask them? What's the next step? So that you have pre-thought these strategies, because otherwise it just becomes anxiety ridden for yourself as well. And then you're both stuck and you're both anxious and you don't know what the next step's going to be. I don't know, Bex, do you have any thoughts or anything to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of that struggle, I think there's sort of ideally you want that struggle to be in their zone of proximal development. So you don't want it to be too far away from what they actually understand at this point. And I think that's what a lot of kids struggle with in the classroom, is that sometimes their gaps in their knowledge can be 2 years below where they are in the classroom. So I know that's different at home and homeschooling. I think in that, something like the mass pathway model is great because it diagnoses the child on where they are at, what sort of like level they're at, and then gives them work that is that next little bit up. So they should find it a little bit of a struggle, but you don't want it to be too far away. Otherwise, yes, they're never going to get out of the pit. If we think about it in terms of the learning pit, they're going to be stuck there. The other thing that I think that's really nice in terms of having safe struggle is that, and you can find a lot of resources for this on Joe Bowler's website on YouCubed, is looking at activities or maths activities that are low floor, high ceiling. So they're really open-ended maths problems They're low floor because they're accessible. Like the very sort of basic level one of the task, for example, everybody can have a go at, and then you can take it in lots of different directions. And I know that I always tried to bring those into particularly my year 7 and 8 classrooms. And what you'd find is the kids enjoyed it. They had fun, and they sort of left at the end of it going, "Oh, that was a great maths lesson today. Really enjoyed it." And even kids who, daily, day on would struggle. And that was enough to sort of give them a little boost of confidence of like, actually I can do it sometimes. And then you sort of build on that over time.
Yeah.
And very often, Bex, that first step was draw it out because everybody can do that, right? They can draw.
Yeah. Can you draw it? Can you build it? Can you hear some counters? Can you like actually see what's going on if it's, growing pattern or something like that? Could be helpful.
Yeah, and you
I
support
love
them. Sorry, Sally.
I love the suggestion of bringing in those other activities. I know in my experience, we're pretty much done with homeschooling now, but we had Friday as kind of fun day. So we'd play maths board games, do those types of different maths activities that you suggested and those things,
Yeah.
just to mix things up, let the kids use something else other than the regular program that we're always using. So yeah, I like those suggestions. Thank you. Yeah.
I did that as a teacher too. Like Bex said, we would do one of those, activities, rich tasks, or we would play games and that sort of
Mm,
thing, just to mix things up. But it does help a lot.
yeah.
Mm, mm.
Perfect. So the other question I had on growth mindset is, and again, I love pulling that into the day-to-day as a regular as part of your lessons and those things. So there's a lots of growth mindset programs, I guess, that have popped up, in recent years that are out there. Do you feel that something like that is necessary or helpful, or do you think even just what you mentioned, just using it at that low level day to day in their lessons is enough for us with our children?
I have not evaluated any of these programs, so I
Okay.
don't know exactly like what they're doing. But from my experience, it was enough, right? Like I saw a transformation in my students as soon as I had those language shifts, as soon as we spoke about the brain growing. It didn't take much, right? It didn't take much to change the entire culture of my classroom and to get kids like Bex said who were like going away and you know trying maths on their own like oh miss I continued working on this with my dad on the weekend or having a kid have their confidence grow and therefore be more receptive to even the traditional parts of your maths learning, right, because they had a positive experience the previous lesson. But you do have to be consistent, right? You do need to be
Yeah,
consistent.
I was going to add that in, Maddie. I think it's a slow burn. It's sort of like you start it, you change that language, and it's just consistency over time that sort of helps to build those changes. And I'm sort of in the same boat. I've not looked at any of the sort of programs that are around growth mindset, and certainly for like in my teaching career, it was very much just taking that sort of like change of language approach and really encouraging kids and sort of getting them to look for things from different perspectives.
Yep.
Yeah. I would also add that the work, so when I mentioned that I had posters up on my wall,
Mm,
just trigger me to remind me to speak in this sort of language. Part of the work that also really helped me was the work of Ron Richard and Mark Taylor. They're out of Harvard. At the time it was Project Zero. And the book that, I'm kind of referring to that brings these ideas together is Making Thinking Visible. So finding ways and things to say to students so that they're thinking they could communicate it. That, in addition to the growth mindset stuff, really helped that culture. So yeah, I don't think you necessarily need to do something, a separate course. It's just what you're doing in your day to day, and having that education, like reading the book, the growth mindset books, is a good idea because as Carol Dweck herself kind of complains, sometimes people misrepresent what she's trying to say. They miss that strategy section, that part of like you have to help the student move forward, right? That's a critical part of her messaging. And so I think having a deep understanding of it as a parent, I think is important.
great. Thanks. And the other thing I wrote down whilst listening to you, and I just wanted for you to clarify, where you mentioned about whatever program we choose to use for maths, that we need to look that it has formative assessments built in. And so I just wanted to clarify that Maths Pathway definitely does do that. I know I've seen that. I just thought you might be helpful to quickly recap just very briefly on how Maths Pathway does do that.
In actually a number of ways. So there's the way that our modules work is the students, as soon as they answer a question, if they answer it incorrectly, they have the ability to both see what the solution is, but also have the opportunity to practice a different style of question. So that's, and then they can constantly check their thinking that it's correct. And also the other important thing is something that Bex touched on is the ZPD and the chunking of the information. Our modules are very carefully scaffolded. So it means that, what we do is we develop their understanding step by step. So they're less likely to get stuck and then they get the feedback if they do get stuck. They have exit tickets. So once they finish a particular chunk of work, they get tested on that work. And then they also do have a more summative assessment option as well. But it's that, like I said, for their learning, that short cycle feedback is essential.
Yep, that's great. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you very much.